Thanks so much for coming today. It's such a pleasure to see so many faces. We're going to be talking about biodiversity net gain, right? So today is going to be asking the question, what contribution can biodiversity net gain make to achieving England's nature recovery goals? And we're going to start with a short 15-minute crash course, so we're all on the same page, which is going to be initiated by Nat Duffus, who's a PhD student here in Oxford, and then I'll talk us through a little bit about what the preliminary data says that the issues are with biodiversity net gain and what needs to be addressed going forwards. So let's start with Nat for a quick crash course.
Okay, hi, Nat, as promised, crash course in BNG is the plan. So I think to understand BNG, biodiversity net gain, and what we're trying to do, we have to think about the current context of nature in England and what we need to do to get to where we want to be. So thinking about growth, we have a really high projected household growth in England. This is between 2016 and 2041, and you can see some hotspots of up to 30% or more projected growth. But at the same time, UK biodiversity is declining, with 15% of species threatened with extinction. And since 1970, more species have decreased in population than increased. And to turn the clock back and recover these species, we need land. And thinking about the 2010 Lawton Review, we need habitats which are bigger, better, more joined up. But that's in competition with this growth, right? Both things need land. So how do we manage this sort of conundrum between growth and nature, and can we do both is the question, and that's where biodiversity net gain comes in. So what is biodiversity net gain? Just to define it, it is a new approach to planning or land management which aims to leave biodiversity in a measurably better state than it was before. And this will be mandatory from November under the Environment Act for nearly all developments requiring planning permission. And it sets out the requirement to achieve at least a 10% biodiversity net gain, and that should be maintained over a period of 30 years. So our hopes for mandatory biodiversity net gain, what do we want it to do? What is kind of the aim here? So the first one is that we're hoping that BNG will create a market for biodiversity units. So when a project can't fulfill its 10% net gain, private landowners will be able to step up, create biodiversity gains and generate some income by selling those units. This will also create a source of funding for habitat banks, which will feed into local nature recovery networks. So that bigger, better, more joined up approach, BNG could be a source of funding to really drive that and invest in these local nature recovery networks. It's hoped that biodiversity net gain will help reverse biodiversity declines by alleviating some of this development pressure on biodiversity. So by putting nature at the very beginning of planning, not as an afterthought, it has a real big role to play, is the thought. And then also, importantly, biodiversity net gain is adding an economic incentive to not harm nature in the first place. So if you're harming a really nice bit of nature, that's going to be very costly. So hopefully biodiversity net gain will redirect development to lower impact areas where developers aren't going to have to pay large sums of money to offset their actions. But I think to understand biodiversity net gain, you have to understand like how it really works. And when we say measurably better, how are we measuring that and how are we defining that? And to really get into that, you have to understand the England biodiversity metric, which is this very snazzy Excel spreadsheet, which is used to calculate the biodiversity baseline of a site and then forecast the future biodiversity and then evidence if you can get your 10% biodiversity net gain. So to break it down into its simplest form, you have your lovely site and you want to calculate your baseline biodiversity units. So you take the size of the habitat and then the distinctiveness. So the distinctiveness refers to rarity, ecological value. Then you take the ecological condition of that site and then the strategic significance, which refers to where the site is in the landscape. Can it contribute to nature recovery networks or other local strategies? So that's your baseline. And then you think about the future. So say you have a piece of land and you want to put a Tesco superstore on it. You think about what will that look like in 30 years? And you then put that same thing into the metric. So you put in your development, so your Tesco, your car park, and then you also put in the habitats that you're retaining. So you put those in as well. any habitats you're enhancing, and then any offsets which you need to meet your 10% biodiversity net gain. So the exact same criteria again, but because we're kind of looking into the future and we can't assure that these things will happen, you have to include some multipliers. So these take into account the difficulty of the proposed creation restoration. They take into account any time lag. So when will you have these new units? When will you have these habitats? Is it in 5 years, 10 years, 30 years? And then also taking into account where these habitats will be. Are they on the site? Are they offsets? Are they 50 miles down the road, 100 miles down the road, that kind of thing. So then you just calculate the difference. Baseline and post-intervention, it should be 10% more. And that is how biodiversity net gain in its essence works. So I think what's interesting for me as an ecologist is the ecological condition criteria. So what makes a good condition habitat? So taking the example here of grassland, if you're doing a biodiversity net gain assessment, you go out with a tick list of habitat features, all to do with vegetation. And to be in good condition, there's some really sensible things like you want to have a certain number of species per meter squared. You want to have variation in the sward height. But then there are some things which I think present some challenges. So you want to have between 1% and 5% bare ground, no more than 5%. You want to avoid having species which are indicative of suboptimal condition, that's in big quotes, which includes spear thistle, creeping thistle, cow parsley, creeping buttercup, nettles, things like that. And then also keeping scrub and bracken to a very low level. So I think immediately you can see that there are some challenges here with defining what good condition is. Some of these features like bare ground, these nectar-rich plants and scrub, they are really important features for invertebrates and other groups of species. So to really define good condition in this way, you're lacking some of that really important nuance that exists in ecology. But putting that to the side, when we think about the metric itself and the way it works, I think we can start to understand what the probable outcomes of biodiversity net gain are. So when you look at the metric and you think about how every developer will be using this metric, you can think about some trends which have the potential to emerge from using this kind of one-size-fits-all approach. So these are my predictions. The first one is that size is just one factor in the metric. You have the other three criteria as well. So what can happen is that large habitats can be traded for smaller ones, so long as they are in better condition, as we just discussed, or they're higher in distinctiveness. So you can trade something which is considered not to be very rare, not to have too much value, for something which is considered to be more valuable. So I think the concern there is it will have an overall reduction in habitat area. The next one is that the multipliers disincentivize destroying habitats which require difficult restoration or recreation. And that's good. We don't want to destroy things which are very hard to replace. But on the flip side, that also disincentivizes developers from using those habitat types in their offset. If you can very easily create gains from simple grasslands, why would you go into much harder forms of recreation such as wetlands or woodlands? So my concern there is that we will see this homogenization of habitat types, all developments and plans going for the same habitats over and over again because they're considered simple to do and the multipliers don't penalize them as much as harder to develop habitats. And then the last one is that habitat restoration and creation is incentivized on or close to the impact site. And this is good from certain points of view. You have habitats which are on developments, so public access to green space will be really good. You'll have like meeting some targets such as like 15-minute access to nature. But then you also have the fact that habitats created under biodiversity net gain will have really high human pressure on them. They'll be kind of squeezed in between developments, and I worry that those won't be as good for biodiversity as offsets could be, which are put into habitat banks and managed effectively to create these big habitat networks. So these are just kind of theoretical concerns based on what the metric looks like and what it does. But I'm going to hand over to Sophus to actually talk about some of the data and preliminary evidence of how biodiversity net gain is functioning. So thank you.
Super, thank you, Nat. Yeah, okay, so these are the kind of theoretical concerns that come out from an understanding of the metric. Now, what does the data say? So for the last 3 years or so, us in Joe Bull's group, first at the University of Kent and now at the University of Oxford, have been working on biodiversity net gain by trying to actually build data sets using real observations to try and understand what kind of outcomes will be delivered. So we've been tracking essentially every development that's been happening in 6 councils in England that started net gain early. So before it actually started implementing it nationally, which is going to come into force from November 2023. And very simply, we've been just aggregating across all these developments and trying to understand, what goes into those metrics and what comes out of those metrics. And in aggregate across all of this development, what are the outcomes that we're seeing? So this is just a really quick schematic of the kind of habitat changes that we're expecting under biodiversity net gain. So this is a preprint that we actually released a couple of weeks ago, but it's a kind of an update to a study that we published in 2021 that was presented quite similar results. But what we can see, if you look at the top graph, which is the changes in the area of different habitat types, right? So for each column, each set of columns represents a habitat type or a set of habitat types in the metric. And on the left-hand side of each of those columns, we have what's there before the development under the baseline condition, and on the right-hand side, what's there after the development occurs. So under this kind of post-development scenario. Now, if we look at the top graph, what you can see is net gain is essentially facilitating a considerable loss of green space. In our data set, which spans about 1,600 hectares, we're talking about the loss of about 500 hectares of green space, conversion to urban habitats. And most of that development is happening on cropland or modified grassland, which is basically pasture on the left-hand side. So we're getting a lot of development happening in sort of low quality agricultural land. And a lot of that is being replaced by urban habitats, by the built environment, with increases in some specific habitat types that end up scoring quite favorable outcomes in the metric, like other neutral grassland, which is popping out here. On the bottom graph, you can see this is the number of actual biodiversity units delivered from these different habitat types. And I think one of the highlights is Nat was worried from an ecological perspective about kind of a biotic homogenization, and we're seeing some of those patterns emerge quite early, right? So we're seeing that about a quarter of all of the biodiversity units delivered by biodiversity net gain are coming from a specific moderate condition, other neutral grassland. So one specific condition level of one specific habitat type from the hundreds that are in the UK habitat classification. And then we can also see that we're getting what Nat predicted. We're getting the kind of the ecological intensification of habitats. So the improvement or projected increases in biodiversity on smaller areas of habitat in the future. And another one of the highlights from this data set is that in our sample of these 6 early adopter councils, we're only seeing about 7.5% of those units coming from biodiversity offsets, right? So that's the conversion or the management of often agricultural land for conservation. So bringing new land into conservation. Over 90% of the biodiversity being delivered in our data set is coming from essentially habitat enhancements within the built environment. We're talking about grasslands within housing estates, etc. And this is kind of interesting finding because the government's estimate for the size of the offset market, which could be used to direct funding into investment in the local nature recovery network or the conversion of agricultural, private agricultural land to conservation areas, their estimate for the size of that market is 25 to 50% of all of the units. In ours, it's less than 10. So this is suggesting that, well, firstly, the preliminary evidence suggests that it might be easier for developers to meet their liabilities on site, and also the caveat here is that when this stuff becomes mandatory, maybe it'll become easier, to buy units from the market when we're more confident that those gains will be delivered, and we have the kind of legal mechanisms in place to deliver that stuff. So for all of the developments in our data set, how are these developments actually achieving their biodiversity net gain? Basically, what you need to know is everything on the right-hand side of this graph is basically meeting all of their liability on site. And everything on the left-hand side of this graph is buying offsets, loosely speaking. And we can, and this is disaggregated by the size of habitats and the size of developments and what kind of developments they are. And the big overall patterns from this so far is basically that small housing developments, which are working within small spatial footprints, can't meet their liabilities on site because there's not enough land to play with, and so they're buying offsets, but really big developments are not. So basically, this is explaining why we have so little investment in the local nature recovery networks and the off-site network here, is because there is stuff that needs offsets. Lots of projects need offsets, but they're really small. So the individual investments are actually really small. The really big developments, the metric is flexible enough for them to meet all of their liability within their own development footprints, right? So that's roughly what's happening across the data set as a whole. Now, one of the things I've been working on for about 3 years, that is something that I've spent much of the last 2 years going around and campaigning about, is the governance of biodiversity net gain. Because I think this is, for me, the single biggest issue to address going forwards. But essentially, you've got the stuff that's going to be delivered within the built environment and the stuff that's going to be delivered through the offset network. And we've got really different governance mechanisms in place to ensure that we get high quality nature from those two pathways. So if we look at the offsite biodiversity units, so this is stuff delivered through offsets and the government's statutory biodiversity credits. In the 2019 DEFRA impact assessment, there's some serious investments to improving the capacity of state, of statutory bodies to deliver this stuff, and local authorities. So we're talking about investment in 1.3 full-time equivalent ecologists for every higher tier local authority in England to deliver biodiversity net gain. We've got a biodiversity credit register. So that's essentially a register of all of the biodiversity offsets that should come into force again when the policy becomes mandatory in November this year. And offsets that register on the data set, in the register, will have to provide monitoring reports every couple of years to demonstrate that they're actually delivering these biodiversity gains. And the government's also created a new legal instrument for protecting biodiversity gains on private land, the Conservation Covenant, which has been brought in specifically to facilitate this new piece of legislation, and some other nice things like giving legal powers to prosecute land owners if they're basically promising to deliver credits, but it's based on false information, right? So they've thought quite hard about how to deliver biodiversity offsets. This looks better, I think, than many of the international comparisons that I work with. But as we've seen from our data set, there is a risk that over 90% of the gains are actually coming on site. Now, the government's proposed no new compliance monitoring or enforcement measures for delivering the biodiversity habitats within the built environment, and that the local planning enforcement mechanisms are essentially considered adequate to deliver this stuff. Here's the problem, is that the local government planning enforcement system is in no way capable of delivering this function. So it's a reactive planning system that relies essentially on reports from members of the public for them to go and investigate violations of planning conditions. And on top of that, central government guidance to local authorities actually suggests that they explicitly don't enforce anything that doesn't meet the threshold of a serious harm to a local public amenity, which is often considered to mean threat to human life, right? So the idea that local governments will enforce, the violation of a planning condition 10 years ago because you didn't deliver a grassland to a specific condition level that you promised in a planning application, I think that is extremely unlikely to be delivered in practice. So, our big concern here is it looks like, according to our data, around 90% of all of the outcomes are essentially ungovernable. Right? So what does this all mean? Well, net gain in our sample of these 6 early adopter local authorities is associated with a considerable loss of the green space that's devoted to nature. It's promising lots of really quite ambitious future condition gains. And in our data set, over 90% of that is coming within developments themselves. Now, in a recent analysis, we quantified how much of this 90% we think actually has a very high probability of non-compliance. In the paper, we go through the specific methodology for calculating this. But in essence, we worry that about 1/4 of all of the biodiversity outcomes of biodiversity net gain are at a very high risk of non-compliance. That there's very few governance mechanisms to ensure that that stuff is delivered in the future, right? So if biodiversity net gain is aiming to achieve a 10% improvement in biodiversity, and 27% of that is very unlikely to be delivered, then this thing doesn't look like it'll be delivering a net gain in biodiversity. The biodiversity offset market may be much smaller than many people hope as it's currently designed because of the flexibility of the metric. And I think the last thing that is really important to say is that the existing planning system deals with biodiversity really, really badly. So despite all of these problems, biodiversity net gain is still representing a kind of polluter pays principle. It is still trying to internalize the externalities of development. And I think it still looks like it's very likely to be better than the existing planning system for biodiversity, but that's really not saying much. Okay, so there's our quick update on biodiversity net gains. Now we're all working on the same page, and we're really my takeaways here is that I think net gain is missing opportunities to raise money for investment in the local nature recovery networks, in these offsite networks, and it's delivering a lot of these biodiversity gains that are potentially overambitious and essentially legally unenforceable. So for me, the highlights here to make sure that this system really works are to sort out the monitoring and enforcement of these on-site units. And another piece of work that we didn't present today, but suggests that there's enormous capacity shortfalls in the local authorities that are supposed to be delivering this stuff. So a recent analysis showed that 60% of local authorities don't have any in-house ecological expertise. So they have 0 staff to deliver this. And so obviously addressing those systematic capacity shortfalls is going to be key to this solution. So very, very happy to introduce today's panel. So today's panel is Nat Duffers, a PhD researcher in biodiversity net gain in the Department of Biology. We've got Professor Joe Bull, who's an associate professor of climate change biology, who's been working on biodiversity offsetting related issues for over a decade. Dr. Prue Addison, who's the strategy director at BBOUT. Professor Alex Teitelbaum, who's an associate professor of economics. And Ben Taylor, who's the CEO of the Trust for Oxford's Environment, one of the key delivery partners in delivering biodiversity net gain in Oxfordshire. So please may I welcome the panelists to the stage. Okay, so the way this is going to work is I'm going to ask a series of questions that I think brings out some interesting answers that are relevant to the expertise of each of our individual panelists, and then write down all your questions. Then we're going to open up to the floor for a long discussion on biodiversity net gain. Hopefully, we'll able to clarify a lot of your questions, talk about solutions for addressing some of these gaps, maybe potentially envisage a pathway to what could be better. This is the kind of things that we're looking for today. So let's start with Nat. So what are your reflections on the way that net gain measures biodiversity, right? And you've been going around visiting real sites to see what kind of habitats will be delivered under biodiversity net gain. What do you think the habitat changes that are on paper delivering these improvements on smaller areas? How do you think that translates into actual biodiversity improvements in the real world?
Cool. So I think the first thing which is important is that we saw in that graph that most of the development was happening on modified grassland, which is pasture, but there are massive variations in what modified grassland looks like and massive variations in the species that it holds. It depends on the context where it sits in the landscape, what habitats are adjoining it. If it's beside cropland or existing development, it's going to have slightly less value than modified grassland, which is beside another grassland, such as chalk grassland. So I think that context is really missing there. And there are some sites which hold a wealth of species which will be undervalued by biodiversity net gain. But saying that, it's very difficult to include these species in a metric that is one size fits all, which is easy to apply across the country on a wide range of developments. So there's a really interesting trade-off in how biodiversity net gain has happened, and creating a metric which is ecologically sound, but is also easy to apply and can be used by a range of consultants. But I think if the metric is not good, then I would be happy to accept it in some form if we were getting large areas of habitat put aside for biodiversity. But what we're seeing is that reduction in green space. So that really gives me concern as to what the 10% net gain will be in. If it's not in species and it's not in habitat area, then I do really have concerns as to what it will be.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks so much. So I think something that follows on quite nicely from that is what could be better? So the next question is for Alex. Alex, you've done a lot of work on the kind of the economic principles that can be used to deliver the best biodiversity most efficiently. Now, is the picture that you're seeing here consistent with those principles? And if not, what are the kind of principles that you might apply to deliver more biodiversity at a given cost?
Fabulous, thank you. So I'm an economist, so I'll speak in economic terms. I work in an area called market design, where actually we think about how to design these kind of very complicated markets like the one we will have for biodiversity net gain. And the sort of the broad message when you're designing a market, trying to get resource allocation to work in a market-like way, which is what this is trying to do, is sort of three principles. One is efficiency, obviously, but the efficiency means something quite precise here. It says, you know, we want the most ecological outcome measured by NAT in a good way per pound, and the per pound bit is very important. These are often, you know, private or public money that is being used for this. It really matters how much this stuff costs. So the second thing is liquidity. So if a market is going to work, trade needs to happen. Prices need to be discovered in some way, and the way that prices get discovered is by a lot of people trading these goods, trying to figure out what the prices need to be. So liquidity comes from when there are a lot of participants or a lot of things that are being traded. And so part of the reason why biodiversity net gain is set up this way, and it's set up in other countries like Germany with eco points in a similar way, is to try to commodify the product that that you want to create the market for. The trouble, of course, when you start out with something like biodiversity is actually every site is extremely heterogeneous. You know, a priori, there's no comparison between a grassland in north of Oxford and a meadow in Scotland. And what the metric does is to try to commodify it. And that's what actually helps the market happen. But in a moment, I'll explain why it's actually, it has, you know, huge consequences for how things pan out. And the last thing, sort of equity, we haven't really talked about this, but I think in many markets, when you're thinking about designing a new market that hasn't sort of emerged naturally, is you have to think about what are the kind of justice implications for it. People are going to be made better and worse off in various different ways. So very important to think and kind of recognize that. So why do I have similar concerns to the ones that Sophus and Nat have already mentioned? In part, the way that I think intellectually the market is set up is very similar to how we think about climate change regulation. And the way we think about this, about climate change, many of you of course know this, is that there is a homogeneous pollutant called carbon dioxide emissions, right? Or maybe there's different types of gases, but we, you know, aggregate them to some kind of carbon dioxide equivalent, and we say, look, we want less of that stuff, right? And we set up a market, and in principle, you pick your favorite quantity of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, there'll be a price that will ensure that this amount of carbon dioxide gets emitted. And in fact, if everyone follows that price, you can set it by a carbon tax, for example, that will be efficient. Efficient in what sense? It will achieve that goal at the lowest possible cost, right? So you decide on the goal how much carbon you want in the atmosphere. I will argue you can create a market, and that's, you know, that's the principle behind something like the emissions trading scheme. So this kind of idea is being used here to set up the biodiversity net gain market. But actually, the crucial step that is being taken here, that can be taken for granted in the regulation of carbon, is the commodification bit. And what happens is that we first need to convert the grassland in North Oxford into some number of points, right? And this has been the pattern throughout these kind of markets elsewhere. But it creates two bad incentives. The first, and in fact, both Sophus and Nat have already hinted at these, but let me put these into economic terms, and so that's why I don't find them surprising. The first one is that because the object is commodified, what you're trying to do is to achieve that goal at the lowest possible cost. So you go through your 100 different types of habitat, and you pick the one that gives you the points at the cheapest possible way, you know, given the site that you. Every developer is going to do that. There is no question about it. That is how people respond to incentives. Okay, so I'm completely unsurprised. I didn't know exactly which type it was, but you know, now we actually see, and we can back this out. It'd be nice to see if this is kind of corroborated by what seems to be the costs of delivering these units. So that's one side of it, and I think that sort of explains a bit about what things are happening on site. The trouble is also what's going to happen off site. I'm not sure I completely. I'm kind of less certain about how much offsetting there will be. To me, this sort of 7% number actually feels like quite low. And I think once the market develops, actually, there'll be a lot of incentive to go into the market. So I suspect it will grow, but please don't hold me to this. Economists making prediction is never a good thing. But my hunch is, given that the costs of accessing this market are being removed, as Sophus has suggested, I think there will actually be more proportionally more offsetting being done. But the homogenization creates very strange incentives on that side as well. And what it does, it doesn't recognize specifically the things that are different about biodiversity that from, say, something like carbon. And it is that things are heterogeneous, they operate more fabulously at large scale, and they need to be connected. So the point is that, you know, two sides adjacent to each other might be way better than having these two sides being separate. But if you have a homogeneous good that's being traded, that is this, you know, unit of biodiversity net gain, and there is only a single price for this, there is no incentive that is pointing you at the fact that these two things need to be next to each other. And so part of the issue is that by allowing the market to operate at the scale, it's just going to deliver projects locally in a fragmented way where they're going to be least costly from the point of view of the individual project about how it's measured. But of course, the social value of these projects is much lower. And in fact, it would have been better, indeed, it would be more efficient to aggregate some of these projects or to make them adjacent to each other or to connect them. But there's nothing in the system that is actually providing that incentive. Now, you might hope, for example, that there's already structures in this market that it could make this work. And in particular, this possibility of intermediation, the fact that there's going to be some, let's say, habitat banks or, you know, organizations like Environment Bank that could basically take the demand for the units that are coming from the developers and actually make the projects that they're realizing be connected and well structured. But again, we don't see any evidence of that happening at the moment. In principle, they could be doing this. They could be, creating the project that they're creating, not just being the cheapest possible ones, but the ones that are actually most ecologically valuable per pound. Unfortunately, the incentive for them is not to do that at the moment either. So I'm hoping things will change. I'm afraid, you know, I'm not actually sure about Sophus's last conclusion that this is better than doing nothing, because I think it will improve nature, but the cost of this is going to be substantial. So I think actually realizing how costly this is going to be and what the opportunity cost is going to be, this money could have been spent so much better if we had set up this market in a better way. And the last thing I might say, am I going too long?
No, great.
Okay, the last thing I want to say is, okay, but what do you do better? How do you actually solve this? Is there a better way? And my answer to you, yes, absolutely, there is a better way of doing it. So you can kind of get best of both if you regulate in a smart way. I'll give you one very quick example. Let's say you want to create habitat in Oxfordshire, and you recognize that there's value from connectivity. You can imagine running an auction for habitat restoration, for example, where the winners are going to be explicitly rewarded for being next to one another, right? So, for example, if I create a really nice bit of habitat and Kathy is my next door neighbor and she creates a bit of habitat, the ecological function in this auction might say, this is really great. And so per pound, this is a really great deal, even if we look kind of expensive individually. And so you can actually use this price system. Now, this kind of auction, because it will be competitive, will still reveal our individual costs of delivering this habitat. And that's a really good thing. It's very important to try to reveal the private costs through a competitive mechanism. But at the same time, it will also recognize the fact that, you know, two projects that are adjacent to each other perhaps are going to be more ecologically valuable than ones that are being spread apart. And so I really encourage those who are in charge of local environmental policy to sort of think about how they're going to use that funding locally to develop these projects. And I really think that kind of, in a way, using this market thinking, but in a centralized way, is going to realize a lot of those efficiency gains that I started out. Thanks.
That's brilliant, Alex. Thanks so much. Ben, do you want to comment on that? Do you want to comment on the principles for how you design good habitat banks that Alex has just outlined? Second? I was just thinking, Ben. I'm going to ask you about finance.
Well, firstly, thank you very much for having me. It's great to be here. So, yeah, I'm just going to kind of go back on some of the themes that have already been kind of brought up. So my organisation, the Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment, the reason we're involved in this at all is that we're trying to deliver nature recovery in an area, Oxfordshire, really against the Lawton principles, actually kind of seeing that as the underpinning set of kind of working principles that we're working towards. And as already been indicated by others, we're working within what's already a rather imperfect system. And the risk is with biodiversity net gain that actually instead of kind of delivering bigger, better, more joined up nature, we're actually doing the opposite. So it's smaller, it's mediocre, and it's everywhere. So how do you work to change that? So I suppose I suppose the conclusions one might draw from all of what's been said are rather pessimistic. But let me try and kind of be a bit more of the optimist. I think you can work within the imperfect system, and actually local intermediation within a market like biodiversity net gain is really important, and local authorities can play a really important role in this, and organisations like environmental NGOs can play a really important role, and local communities and local politics can also play an important role in holding what's going on the ground to account. In terms of what you actually need to deliver nature recovery projects, I think the bit of the whole equation that's so often forgotten is land. It's all about land. We have a finite amount of land, and although that may seem obvious, if you look at the policy debates around land management, land and nature recovery at large, you can be forgiven for thinking that actually, when we're having conversations about infrastructure, nature recovery, agricultural policy, the lived environment, all of these other things that we were talking about, some different sort of parallel universes. Actually, we have a finite amount of land in a county like Oxfordshire. We need to kind of decide how we're going to use that in the right way, in the most effective way, and to deliver nature recovery. And if we're not going to get into the business of wholesale expropriation of land, which we're not, then we need to have a conversation about land ownership, land management, and to engage landowners. So the most important point from the point of view of an organisation working to deliver nature recovery with biodiversity net gain is to have that conversation with landowners, to look at how we can incentivise landowners to engage with nature recovery, to bring to create the economic environment where this is going to be competitive. Nature recovery is going to be competitive with, for example, agricultural incomes, so that we get a change in land use, and that is essential if we're going to get nature recovery occurring at the scale that we need it to happen. Only a very small percentage of the land in a county like Oxfordshire is owned by environmental organisations, and that's not going to change significantly. So we need to have those economic incentives in place, and we need to have ways in which we can also incentivise nature recovery, which isn't mediocre. So the metric has already been described. It kind of incentivises other neutral grassland. And that is one of the big drawbacks to the system. But it's not inevitable, and you can use the system in order to you can subvert the system from within. You can try and deliver something which is better than just the most economically advantageous, which is definitely to take a ploughed field and turn it into other neutral grassland. So you can create systems which are going to allow, which are going to incentivize landowners to deliver things which are distinctive, habitats which are distinctive and of higher value, and importantly more joined up. So I think one of the other key things which I'd highlight is the importance of partnerships, and the partnerships between organisations and landowners, between private sector organisations and third sector organisations and local government, and looking at ways of delivering at scale, high quality, and strategically in a way that's aligned with local nature recovery. So, for example, the way in which Trust for Oxfordshire's Environment and BBAP, for example, are working together to try to optimise what can be done within an imperfect system.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm going to move on to Prue now to talk about the economics of actually running habitat banks. Okay, so what do the economic incentives look like? How can you build a good business model around delivering a habitat bank in Oxfordshire?
Thank you, Sophus. I'll answer that question in a moment, but I think I need to provide a little bit of context as to why the Wildlife Trust are here dealing with biodiversity net gain. So I belong to your local wildlife trust. I'm the Conservation Strategy Director. We've decided it is better to participate in this market rather than sit back and watch it happen possibly very badly. And we're doing this from a number of angles. So first of all, at the very start, we work as a national movement of wildlife trusts where we lobby government to always make further improvements to environmental policy. So that's certainly, we're always pushing. Every time there's an opportunity through consultation, we're always scrutinising, and feeding back through that process. Locally, we have a team of biodiversity officers who screen development applications in Oxfordshire, Berkshire and Buckinghamshire. So they're looking for issues with developments that are causing any harm to the environment, to nature. And part of that, we've always done that for a very long time, but now the new part of that is scrutinising the metric calculations that are coming through from developers and picking up lots of errors and mistakes and pointing those out to those local planning authorities and suggesting that they really need to be addressed for that planning application to be approved. Next, we've got a consultancy, Future Nature, which is exactly, is designed to work with developers from the very start of a development to make sure that harm is minimised or even avoided for nature. So again, working at that, that very early stage. And then we've decided also at the very end stage of the offsets to develop our own habitat banks. So that is now what I'm going to talk about. So we've launched our first habitat banking site in Oxfordshire. It's in the Vale of Whitehorse. It's called Duxford Old River. We launched it earlier this year with the support of TOW, who have been processing developer funds already. And basically this site is the way that we want to deal with the off-site solution in biodiversity net gain is to find strategic sites, first of all. So this one is already next to one of our largest nature reserves. So it now creates about 300 hectares of nature reserve in Oxfordshire. It's at the heart of a conservation target area. It is part of the draft nature recovery network for Oxfordshire. So it's hitting all the strategic, making things better, and more joined up. So for us, we acquired this site a few years ago through the very generous donations, grants from TOW, but also from members of the public and our members who contributed to allow us to purchase that land, which was fantastic. A few years on, we've been working on it, looking at how we could make this a habitat bank. So by a habitat bank, I mean, currently it's very poor value in biodiversity measured by the metric. We have a vision for that site, which is on the Thames, to create a floodplain mosaic with scrub and really take a nature-led management approach for that site. So we've planned out what the vision is for over 30 years, and then we've started to work out, okay, how much do we think this is going to cost us over 30 years to create this, in order for us to work out, therefore, how many units we're generating and how much we can sell those for. It's quite, it's been quite an exercise. We've been spending probably about the last 18 months on this to work this out, because it's, just imagine any part of your life trying to work out 30-year projection of how much one, aspect of your life is going to cost in full, and try and get that cost right. So we've done a big exercise with our land managers who have over 60 years collectively. We've got experience in land management, so we should have a rough idea of how much things cost. But basically, we've developed a massive spreadsheet to estimate all the costs. All the times the fencing is going to need changing, how much it's going to cost for cattle grazing, staff costs. What's inflation going to look like over 30 years? How much contingency do we need? How much is this site going to flood? What's climate change going to do to this site? So there's been amazing amounts of oh God, we've got to think about a lot of things. So we come up with this projection of total cost and add a good, dose of contingency in there in case we get it wrong. And then what we do is we've worked out the number of units that can be generated on that site and how much we can therefore, we need to sell those to cover the full costs of 30 years of management of that site. So I don't think that's actually been mentioned, the 30 years. So basically, it is required that units are created and maintained over 30 years. So our habitat bank has to be in existence for at least 30 years. If we were an average landowner, we'd be like, right, 30 years, that's it. And then we could do what we want with the land. But as a wildlife trust, we want to manage this in perpetuity. So we're also factoring in trying to get investment into that site to actually put into, to hold as investment to keep us being able to manage that going forward beyond the 30 years. But the question is, how can we, the market hasn't fully started yet. There are developers seeking to buy units in the Vale of Whitehorse, but it's still a fairly small, there's not that much going on just yet. So the question for us is, the cost is well over £2 million for us for the 30 years. And we need to work out, okay, how many units should we sell now or sell in the future to try and make this money back at the right time? And so we've been working with some finance experts called Finance Earth, who have been helping us financially model when we should actually think about selling those units. So to begin with, we've sold a batch to Trust for Oxygen's Environment, which will keep us going for a couple of years, but really we want to be selling as much as we can initially to start to get the market going and to show them what good, what a really good habitat bank looks like, managed by the Wildlife Trust, going well above and beyond what the biodiversity metric tells us. So the other thing that we're doing is, we're measuring with the biodiversity metric, but we'll be doing all sorts of other monitoring of species and, the things that are missed by that metric to make sure that we can tell that story and actually understand, how things get restored through time, through a nature-led management approach. So there's a lot of uncertainty. But we think because we already own the site now through that generous, donations